What an absolute train wreck. This was the game that PlayStation owners were propping up as a must-own title on the PS2. This less than 10-hour long adventure in which this androgynous-looking twink infiltrates a cleanup facility that's secretly hosting Metal Gears. It is one of the most baffling games I've ever played. And I've held that opinion for quite a long while because growing up, hearing about this game and then playing it myself and realizing just how bad it actually was, it really is the shining example of everything wrong with Hideo Kojima, Metal Gear Solid, and the PlayStation brand as a whole. Because I think if this had come out on any other console at any other time, general audiences would have been much more critical of its meager gameplay, its nonsensical story, and its unlikable characters, because this is a game that does not live up to the original Metal Gear Solid. It's kind of shocking, actually, just how much more creativity and fun there is in the original MGS. MGS2 is like the PS2 equivalent of The Last of Us Part 2. And that isn't really a comparison I'm making lightly. You think I'm exaggerating, but in a lot of ways, MGS2's message essentially boils down to the same exact thing that Neil Druckmann wants to get across. This idea that you're a loser for playing video games. The idea that subverting your expectation means that this is some deep and profound story. The fact that it's meta, bro, means it has some deep, meaningful symbolism behind it. When you really look at MGS2, when you look at the way game journos tried to cope about this game's obvious failings, the narrative they came up with at the time that this was the first postmodern video game. This was a title that was meant to examine people's reception to the first game and subvert their expectations. And as a result of that, the game being bad somehow makes it good. And this is and always has been a giant cope in general. This is how I feel about postmodernism. But in MGS2's case, it's really interesting to see how this narrative was introduced, how it was accepted for a long time, and now, a couple of decades after launch, people like me are going back, replaying the game again, and addressing all of its very, very real flaws. Because even if the game was some deep narrative, complex masterpiece, it still fundamentally wouldn't be a good stealth game. It still would have a very boring overworld. It wouldn't have good boss fights. It wouldn't have a good, engaging mission structure. When you look at what MGS2 does, in spite of its very clear technological advancements over the original, what you get is a product that feels somehow limited. It's kind of shocking how little combat encounters I got into in my playthrough of the game. It's appalling just how uninteresting the antagonists are. It's crazy with how much exposition there is and how much talking there is, how little presence the antagonists have. When you really examine MGS2 as a product, what you end up coming away with is something that just fails in everything it's trying to do. So even in the ways that the game succeeds, most notably probably with how unintentionally red-pilled it is, when you look at the product as a whole, those sequences feel like they come out of place. They feel like they're not well executed. They feel like they're not really willing to address the real problems. They're not willing to address the implications. All MGS2 does is throw a bunch of crazy, random stuff at you at the end, and you're just supposed to accept it. And
especially with the power of hindsight on our side, with the power of the sequels, it's safe to say that a lot of the ideas and concepts in this game that people thought would grow into incredibly evocative plot lines later on ended up not amounting to anything. Seeing how many iconic characters from the first game, such as, Nastasha Romanenko or Mei Ling, don't really have a presence in this game in favor of a bunch of unmemorable, annoying characters such as Vamp or Rose. The problem with Metal Gear Solid, I think, began with this game, in that it began to feel as if being convoluted and ridiculous was more important than making an actual good video game. And this is a problem that Metal Gear Solid never really got away from. Metal Gear Solid 3 was definitely a step in the right direction and definitely was a really cutting edge, engaging video game at the time. But in a lot of ways, a lot of problems from MGS2 really did carry over. Some of the themes and ideas that just kind of would go on to implode the series of MGS4. There was just no real recovery from what they did here. And it really does need to be talked about more, just what a disappointment this game actually is. This, to me, is a really good example of everything wrong with the PlayStation 2. Something that coasted entirely by its realistic, mature, narrative-driven games to an audience that didn't really know anything about video games or respect them or care about them at all. MGS2 at the time was damage controlled because of this idea that this was some deep, complex narrative written by someone who really, really pushed the envelope when it came to narrative-driven cinematic video games.
In short, Metal Gear Solid 2 is essentially the PlayStation 2 equivalent of The Last of Us. Something that was overhyped by the gaming media, that never really addressed its very real crippling flaws, that really led the game to be really devalued among the actual fan base. Everyone prefers 1 and 3 because they're way better games overall. Now, you might have noticed that I haven't been talking a lot about the game itself, focusing more on the story and the themes and the way game journos received this game when it first came out. And that's because when you talk about the actual gameplay, what you're left with is a mediocre action game that's not really even a stealth game. You, Raiden, are essentially going from point A to point B, trying to accomplish your various mission objectives, whatever that may be. You're going around dismantling bombs, you're trying to interrogate hostages, you're trying to save a specific girl so she can do something for you. The mission's always evolving and changing, and unlike the original MGS, it does feel like there's a lot of active players all on board. Like, it feels like you're often given completely different mission directives than what you were given initially. But when you really stop and think about it, when you look at what's happening, you realize that what you're seeing is essentially a remake of the original Metal Gear Solid. So much so that the entire plot of the game is about it. The Patriots orchestrated this situation in order to artificially recreate Shadow Moses and establish a new Solid Snake, essentially. This was all about furthering their control. And that's an interesting idea, if you think about it. It's certainly a little bit different, and it really thinks outside the box, but at the same time, it doesn't make for an interesting video game, because Raiden and the characters around him are not really proactive characters in their own right. They're essentially just
doing the same thing Snake would do if he was in his position, right? There's no real thought put into like the world building or the characters or the lore. Like when you think about it, the game is just an afterthought. The game itself is an afterthought to like the story that Kojima wants to tell. And that does not make for a good video game. You know, there are a handful of interesting segments. There's this one segment early on where you're like dismantling bombs and they're all well hidden and you have to think outside the box and use like a lot of your new techniques to find them. And there's another segment where you have to swim through a flooded arena area to reach a hostage that you have to then bring back. You know, every time the game tries to innovate or do something different, it just automatically falls apart and just becomes another aspect of just rehashing Metal Gear Solid 1 again. To me, this is the game's major failing, is that this idea of remaking Metal Gear Solid 1 in universe just seems overly convoluted and doesn't really make for an interesting, fun video game. The cope for this is and always has been this idea that the story is what's driving the gameplay forward, right? This is part of the plot. This is all part of the vision, but the vision sucks. This really needs to be explained that the villains aren't interesting. Their plan, which is to wreak havoc and seize control away from the Patriots, essentially amounts to the same thing you're doing in Metal Gear Solid 4. So I have to ask myself, you know, looking at what actually happens in MGS2, like, did Solidus do anything wrong? Because it's bizarre seeing, like, playing this game and seeing him give the same kind of speech that, you know, Senator Armstrong gives at the end of Metal Gear Rising with none of the real impact or the memorable moments, right? Like, this game was outdone by Metal Gear Rising. You know, a spin-off game that didn't really have half the effort or resources put into it. And in a lot of ways, Rising is better than this. It establishes Raiden as a more interesting character, it has a more fleshed out combat system, it has better boss fights, and it has a way better, like, it has just way more interesting characters and a vibe to it. Like, this, in comparison, comes off like a beta test, honestly. It's kind of shocking just how similar this game is to Rising in certain respects, and seeing just how much better Rising was than this. Because Rising, at its core, fundamentally understood that it was a video game. They understood how to present like all the cool things Raiden and the other characters do in cutscenes in actual gameplay. And as a result, they made some of the most memorable cutscenes in gaming. Like, I always think about that sequence where Raiden just whirls around and throws that Metal Gear Ray like 500 feet in the air and then like leaps up downward and like slashes it in half. Like, that is such a cool, memorable moment. And you get nothing like that in this. You know, Raiden doesn't become... The point of the game is that Raiden is essentially becoming his own character and is kind of like building his own story and forging his own connections and doing what he wants to do with his life and stuff like that, instead of just, you know, following in the footsteps of Solidus or Snake. That's the idea, but like that doesn't really come across in the game at all. You know, you get all this crazy exposition about Raiden's backstory, his relationship with Solidus, all the stuff he's done, and nothing really comes of it. You know, it's so shocking because Raiden is such an interesting character, and yet this game doesn't really do him justice at all. In fact, I would say that's true for like the majority of the interesting characters in this game. You know, Emma Emmerich, Otacon, Solidus, right? You know, like Ocelot, like they introduce all this weird nonsense about the arm, like Liquid's arm, like taking control somehow. And, you know, by the time Metal Gear Solid 4 comes around, like, oh no, it was just Ocelot the entire time. Like, it just all feels contrived. I've heard people describe this game as if like the identity of the Patriots was never meant to be revealed. This idea that like there was no real answer to all these questions this game raised in regards to like the identity of the Patriots, and it's just a giant cope, honestly. Like, Kojima and his team like created something that's completely incoherent and has no real point to it. Like, none of the ideas they had came together at all. And I'm honestly feeling at this point, playing this game again, that this has to be the weakest Metal Gear game. Nothing about it really stuck with me at all. There are some funny moments. There are some things to look back on. Like, it was a technological showcase at the time, but you look at everything this game does. The existence of Vamp, the single worst Metal Gear character in history. You look at just ruined plot threads. You look at just like everything the game tries to do. And you just realize that it's building up to something that never actually happens. In a lot of ways, Metal Gear Solid 4 is a bigger letdown than this is, because this game revolves around this idea that there's this vast conspiracy controlling everything, and what does 4 reveal? It's just some guy in a wheelchair. It's awful. It is really unbearably awful to kind of think about this game in any way, shape, or form. And there's just nothing good to say about it, honestly. Like, I would honestly say that, like, in 2025, like, there's no reason to come back to this at all, because you're not going to see more Metal Gear. You're not going to see Raiden again. You're not going to see these actors again, right? This is it. This is the Metal Gear Solid, like, series. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and of those, only 1 and 3 are any good. And the reason for that is that they understood at their core that they are actual video games. There are interesting aspects about them. They reveal more about the Metal Gear setting, but the more grounded setting of both really allows the more creative, wacky elements of the series to shine. When they come full front and center like this, when Ocelot gives some like contrived explanation as to like what's actually happening with Fortune, and like why bullets can't hit her, and then like she turns it around on him and reveals that like he doesn't actually know anything. It's like it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't leave much of an impact. It doesn't resonate with you the way that like the plot twists of Metal Gear Solid 1 or 3 do. Like, to me, this is a video game that believes itself to be far smarter than it actually is. It's a video game that thinks that it's a movie. And as a result of that, you should be judging it by the author's intentions rather than like what the product actually is. Please don't question my creative decisions. Please don't question the lack of real stealth gameplay. Please don't question the low quality boss fights or the decision to use Raiden as a character. Please don't talk about any of that, because it was all intentional, bro. I made it suck on purpose, and that's what makes it great. Like, that to me is appalling behavior. To me, I think this is the project that really proves just how much of a fraud Hideo Kojima actually is. This is a game that doesn't live up to the hype or its reputation. And one of the more interesting things I noticed about it, something that I don't see a lot of other people talk about, is all the really good, memorable moments that people look back on and remember when it comes to the story and the characters. All of that is through codec conversations. When you're watching the cinematics, you're getting like ridiculous things that make no sense. Like Vamp sitting on top of water that has no buoyancy to it. You have like that scene where the President Johnson grabs Raiden's balls. You're a man. Like, you have like all this goofy like slow-mo and just awful like cinematics. And then you have like the really good, compelling, interesting sequences through the codex. And a quick look at the credits kind of showcases what's going on here. Someone else did the codec conversations. Someone else did all the world building, developed all these characters past their shallow portrayal in the actual game, and made them all relatively well developed and interesting, even if like they don't have a lot to do with like the primary game. And you look at the credits for the codec conversation, and you realize It was the other guy who wrote those. Hideo Kojima's uncredited co-writer came up with all of the best memorable lines and sequences from Metal Gear Solid 2. A fact that is proven by the quality of the series going down after his departure from the franchise after Metal Gear Solid 3. It's really notable, the lack of quality that that came about once he was off the project. And Kojima, I think, should be ashamed of not treating the real talent behind these games with the respect that they deserve. And it's not just him, right? These games have like really memorable music, iconic moments, like great character models, like this was a cutting edge project at the time, but even back then it was held back by Hideo Kojima's hubris.